Call to Action has provided both the community and the museum with the unique experience of learning, communication, and understanding. We've been pleased to draw the support of so many of our fellow citizens interested in the history of Dallas and the nation. But more importantly, it has been rewarding to showcase the exceptional people who worked and are working to secure equal rights for all Americans. And so tonight we're delighted to present a panel of disability rights advocates who have championed the movement for decades. And it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Dr. Richard Scotch. And I have to say, he and his wife and his daughter have been loyal supporters of the Call to Action series, have come to many of our programs. So I thank you very much for helping champion our cause. Dr. Scotch is Professor of Sociology and Political Economy at the University of Dallas, Texas at Dallas. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago and Harvard University. Prior to joining UT Dallas faculty in 1983, he served as AAAS Congressional Science Fellow in the Office of Congressman Paul Simon. He is the author of 2 books on disability politics and policy, as well as numerous articles and monographs on social policy reform in disability, healthcare, education, and human services. He's an active volunteer in local health and human services community, and he is currently researching community-based service delivery systems for people with chronic health conditions and on health disparities affecting minorities, including people with disabilities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Scotch.
Thank you. It's a real treat to be here tonight for 2 reasons. I often take advantage of opportunities to talk about disability issues when they are opportunities outside of the usual stigmatized basement of studying disability in the health professions. And so in a class on politics or a class on social movements or a class on public policy, I'm glad to be there, and I'm so happy that the 6th Floor Museum has chosen to include this important movement in their series on social movements. And these important activists join the other activists who've been part of discussions here. The second reason I'm really happy to be here is as someone who's studied the disability rights movement for over 25 years, it's really a pleasure to be sharing a stage with 3 of its heroes. And I will give them each a very brief introduction and then ask them to more or less introduce themselves by talking about how they became involved in this issue personally, and then we can talk about some of the issues of both historically and in current times. But to my immediate left is Ralph Rouse, who is Regional Manager for the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Health and Human Services. Ralph has been active within HHS as an advocate for disability rights and a variety of other issues for many years, and has been involved both here in Dallas and in Washington in legislative and public policy advocacy, both within the government and as part of shaping those policies. To his left is Bob Kafka. Bob is one of the main people involved in perhaps the premier advocacy group in the disability community now, ADAPT, from when it was focused on public transportation issues in the 80s, when he was head of the Texas Paralyzed Veterans Association, to its current focus on shutting down nursing homes and promoting community-based services. Bob has been one of the leading voices in the debate over disability policy and disability rights. To his left is Kent Waldrep, who perhaps is best known of our panel here in Dallas. Kent has been very active as a policymaker in the National Council on Disability and helped to actually help to name the Americans with Disability Act, as well as draft it back in the 1980s, and has been very active in both treatment and access to services and research, having been the leader of the Kent Waldrep National, and I probably am getting the name wrong because I'm trying to do this by
Foundation.
National Paralysis Foundation and the American Paralysis Foundation Association and several other organizations. So let me just finish my introduction by Bob has called his theory of movement advocacy a pitchfork. And I think we have the best illustration of that pitchfork here today. As a student of social movements, you need the guys on the outside who are raising the issues out in the streets and mobilizing people who have not had voices. But you also need people who are in government who can respond to those and lead within public policy organizations. And you also need people who represent consumers of services, but also can influence through leadership in private sector organizations, both foundations and in the corporate community. So we have three excellent representatives of the various prongs of our pitchfork of disability rights. What I'd like to ask each of you to get us started is to give us a little background on how you first became aware of issues of disability rights and began to become part of this movement. So Ralph, why don't you get us started?
Okay. Well, I think I'm the oldest of the three, so I'm probably the right one to start with. Prior to the 1970s, there were no federal laws that protected the rights of people with disabilities. There were numerous state and local laws that limited the rights of people with disabilities. You might be surprised to hear that there were state and local laws that did such things as deny people with disabilities the right to vote, the right to hold public office, the right to marry, the right to sit next to a person of the opposite sex on public transportation. There were laws that denied them other fundamental rights with regard to access to various kinds of programs and opportunities that mainstream people take for granted. There was even a city ordinance known as the Ugly Ordinance. And this was an ordinance in a prominent city, which will go unnamed, that said that anybody who was considered unsightly were subject to arrest if they were seen on public ways or thoroughfares. And so it's a storied history of denial of opportunity that led to the creation of federal law, which helped to pave the way for the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm 63 years old. I was injured when I was 20 years old, so I was injured in 1963. And at that time, there were no federal laws of any kind that protected people with disabilities from, the denial of opportunity. What there were vocational rehabilitation programs that tried to create opportunities for people to get training and get the opportunity to become employed. So when I was injured in 1963, I was in college, and there wasn't a college or university really in the country. The University of Illinois claimed it was accessible, but that depends on your definition of accessibility, but there really wasn't a college or university in the country that was truly accessible for a mobility impaired person. So the way we had to do it was sort of walk up the steps or get help up the steps, whatever we could do in order to get the education we needed in order to continue. So I experienced that, and it was just that experience of becoming disabled, having been an able person who became disabled, and having to face the inaccessibility of society that got me interested in the whole area of disability. And then circumstance had it that after I went through my college, which was inaccessible, and figured a way to do that, I started looking for employment and I couldn't find a job. But I had a rehabilitation counselor who represented me in trying to find work. So I turned to him and said, well, you know what I can do. Why don't y'all hire me? And so I was hired by the Vocational Rehabilitation Program in Arkansas as the first person with a mobility impairment who was hired by the Vocational Rehabilitation Program back in, I think it was 1969. And I worked in state government and then had the opportunity to come to work for the federal government in the rehabilitation program. I stayed there about 4 years, and then the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Title V of that act, became law, and they created offices to provide technical assistance to states on how to comply with the new disability rights law, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And so I got into it, the government part of it, of the beginning of the civil rights efforts, right at that point. And Title V of the Civil Rights Act is really the mother law to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that's how I got started. I'm going to give my colleagues an opportunity to say something.
Bob?
Well, until I broke my neck in 1973, my only real experience with disability was actually threefold. One, there was Harvey, a guy with cerebral palsy who used to walk the dog all the time, and everybody always called him Old Weird Harvey. And, so I used to know Harvey, just seemed like a nice guy. But he was about 45, living with his parents, which seems strange, but that's, we never really got to know Harvey much, except that he walked the dog. There was Rona. She was a woman with, a cognitive disability, and everybody made fun of her in the neighborhood. I remember really feeling strange about that, but, people, would just, because she was a little slower than people and everything else. And then the most bizarre thing, now that I'm sort of aware of it, is I went to school at Christopher Columbus High School. Right across the street was the New York School for the Blind. Beautiful campus, iron gate over there. I have never once in all my time in New York City in the Bronx ever saw a blind person. And, now that I have a disability awareness, it just strikes me about what was happening back when I was going to school, high school in the mid-60s. I broke my neck in 1973 and went through my rehab in a VA hospital where I got involved with the Paralyzed Veterans of America. A guy walked by and made me a life member, just by signing you up. It was sort of an interesting, and I realized after I got out and lived with my sister for a little while because my parents' place was inaccessible, was that I wanted to go someplace where it didn't snow. So I ended up going back to the University of Houston, where I had gotten my undergraduate degree because it was flat and I knew it didn't snow in Houston. And there is really where I got involved with disability by volunteering. I went to our local coalition, the Coalition for Barrier-Free Living's first meeting. And I learned then is that don't volunteer if you don't, because they make you chair of something. It was, and that was really the beginning of my involvement. Back then, it was the local groups that actually became and were the sort of parent organizations of what became the independent living movement. Coalition for Barrier-Free Living morphed into the Houston Center for Independent Living and was one of the first independent living centers in the country in 1977, 78 in that. But what's interesting is back then you had the Housing Committee, the Education Committee, the Architectural Barriers Committee, all the same issues that we're confronting still today in one way or the other. We've moved in some fashion, but the actual committees that were there back in the late 70s and some of the issues that we were addressing sort of at a lower level before 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act are still the exact same issues that we're dealing with, granted at a different plateau. But, and so from there, I had gotten involved with our state coalition, and the way I got involved with ADAPT was I got this flyer, and it was a picture of a bus in a toilet bowl, and it said, "Don't flush, organize." And so it was a training that was going to be in Washington, D.C. And so I thought it was a training. I'm by nature probably a closet bureaucrat. I don't wear a suit like Ralph, but, I sort of am policy wonk in a lot of ways. And so I thought I was going to a training, and it was from there I ended up doing my first direct action, and the first time I got arrested in 1983. So, and my involvement with ADAPT and grassroots organizing has sort of stemmed from that. But I think the foundation, I go back even before I had my disability, is from, my grandparents were union organizers and involved in the civil rights and, activists in their own nature. And I think some of that, I always, my grandmother's grave says, rebel with a cause is written on there. And I think that's what has sort of fueled a lot of what I still do today.
Thanks. Ken?
I'm the baby of the group, so I enjoy being up here with my senior citizen colleague.
Mr. Kafka to you.
Mr. Kafka. I think what's interesting is that we all share a perspective of living in this world as a, quote, normal, able-bodied person for a good number of years before injuries put us into the world of disability. So to me, for the last 32 years, Bob was injured in 1973. I was injured playing football in 1974. And kind of similar to Bob's perspective on it, what I remember about disability before my injury, the most vivid memory I have is going to the 5th grade at Stephen F. Austin Elementary in Grand Prairie, just down the road. And there was a young man by the name of Coley, and Coley had cerebral palsy. Now, I didn't even know that's what he had until I became more aware of other disabilities after my injury. But Coley was a young man. He was the only child that I remember, the only kid with a disability in that school. And it was pretty severe cerebral palsy. But I can remember that while I think every one of us made fun of him at some point or the other, we also all looked out for him. And it was it was an experience that immediately came to my mind in the months and years after I was hurt, and then started seeing the change in other people as they viewed me now in a wheelchair. Ralph was injured in 1963. I mean, I can't even imagine what he faced in trying to get out and participate, just going to the movies or going out to eat or anything else, because even in the 70s, it was really difficult to, to find places in public where where access was, somewhat achievable. So that prevented a lot of people with disabilities from ever participating in, in a lot of what society had to offer in the early years. My first really role with disability rights came as a result of being appointed to the National Council on Disability, which is a federal agency appointed by the president, and I was appointed by President Reagan in 1981. And that was controversy enough in itself, because disability rights has always been identified more as a democratic movement, and President Reagan was certainly one of the more conservative Republican presidents in recent history. So his appointees were naturally looked at as these right-wing folks that were going to put disability back in the closet and not move it forward. So we faced, I think, a challenge in the early years of convincing the disability community itself that we actually represented their perspective in many ways. The appointees to that council had a variety of disabilities, and there were parents of kids with disabilities. So the perspectives were very mixed, and I think that by the time the ADA rolled around, folks like Bob and ADAPT had been in front of our council, educating us to their issues and what their concerns were with the way federal programs were managed, the way federal dollars were directed, and it was really an experience for me that showed me the breadth of the issue of disability in this country, and why there was a real need for organizations like ADAPT and for people like Ralph and myself to work within the government in trying to bring about change. So that might be a good place for us to.
Yeah, let's talk about the changes that were needed. Each of you came to these issues and realized them in part from your own experience, in part from seeing the experience of others. But maybe you could give us a little insight into what some of the barriers that people with disabilities face and why that required a social movement. I know the Lou Harris poll back in the 80s, when they asked people with disabilities what was causing problems for them, the answer that came up most was discrimination. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what the nature of that discrimination was and why it required some kind of political or public response.
Well, as I said earlier, I kind of got started providing technical assistance on how to comply with the first disability rights law. And then later I assumed the job I'm currently in, which is the regional director that actually directs the investigators that investigate discrimination with regard to health and human service programs, which is our focus in the Department of Health and Human Services. So I've seen it from both the perspective of a consumer and as a state and then a federal government official dealing with some of the issues that people with disabilities face. And boy, there's more than we could cover in the short period of time we have, but you can almost track what Title V of the Rehab Act and then what the ADA addresses to point out many of the fundamental issues. When you look at Title V of the Rehab Act, Title 501 or Section 501 of that title deals with employment. Employment is absolutely one of the greatest problems that we've had in the past and we have right now. I forget the latest figures, but it's something like 80%.
Yeah, it's still close to 80%.
80% of the people with disabilities who are actively seeking employment are unemployed. And that's a disgrace when you look at the unemployment of any other population of people. So that would be number one.
Well, I mean, imagine if they released that figure when they released the national figures on unemployment. I mean, we're all happy when it drops below 6%.
So you start there, then you look at Section 502 created the Architectural and Transportation Barriers Compliance Board. Architectural and transportation barriers were everywhere. We've made a dent in that, but there's still a lot of them. But you could look at Section 502 as being addressing the issues of architectural and transportation barriers for a population of people. Section 503 dealt with employment as well. Section 501 dealt with employment in the federal government, which was almost non-existent for people with disabilities, and still is not good with regard to the rate of employment of people with disabilities in the federal government. Section 503 dealt with the private sector, and it said that those who got federal contracts were to take affirmative action to employ people with disabilities. And so they were mandated in receiving those federal contracts to take that affirmative action. And then Section 504 dealt with the whole package of any agency or institution that receives federal funds, providing equal opportunity in their employment, in access to their services, and in the way in which they conducted their services, that they provided opportunities for all people, including people with disabilities. So you look at Title V and you see that, and you look at the Americans with Disabilities Act, which occurred some 17 years later, and you see that it deals in Title I with employment, in Title II with state and local government services, and one of the big efforts that ADAPT is dealing with right now is the whole business of providing opportunity for people with disabilities to not live in institutions, but to live in the community. And what is more fundamental than where you want to live to a person's existence and opportunity? Title III of the Act deals with public accommodations, which is all kinds of different businesses, shopping centers, places where people go and congregate, and making sure that those institutions realize that they need to provide opportunities and access to people with disabilities. Title IV of the ADA deals with the issue of communication to hearing impaired people, and requires that all states create a system for allowing people who are hearing impaired or deaf to be able to communicate by telephone. And so every state has a relay system now where they're able to allow deaf people to call a relay station and have their communication communicated to people who they wish to communicate with. So it opened up a lot of avenues for the deaf population. And then in both Titles II and Titles III, they deal with transportation in the public and in the private sector. So those are the issues really that many of us deal with and that these laws address.
I think even if you step back and you see where we came from, I mean, I think disability has always been seen as, we're the other. We've always been out of the sort of mainstream, and we've been, defined first even way back in biblical terms, I mean, it was a sin to have a person with a disability. I mean, it was really like something to be hidden. And then, then we got defined sort of by a medical model, the sort of in the 1850s, and people with disabilities and paternalism, really took over. And so, the fact that we're even talking about disability rights is really fairly, very current in terms of that. And so, but just the whole idea of people with disabilities sort of being seen as part of the community, the normal, evolution of life, is still not there. And I think it's the foundation of still all the discrimination that we talk about around these issues. I'll never forget this. I was the president of the Texas Paralyzed Veterans. And so when Kenny Rogers came out with this song, Ruby, oh, Ruby, don't take your love to town. It's hard to love a man whose legs are bent and paralyzed. Oh, Ruby. So I was outraged, and I thought, oh, okay, I was going to take this to our board. They were going to all upset, and we were going to take it nationally to their thing. I couldn't get them to even pass the resolution, because there was this own self-hate in terms of that. They believed that same thing, this whole thing. And some of that, I think, is part of what is the discrimination, the issues that Ralph brought up, housing, employment, education is still there. But, even today, we got a law passed, 94-142, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, it was called. Then it was changed to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And if you go, I'm sure, anywhere in Dallas, anywhere in Texas, we still have segregated schools behind the regular school. 30-something years since we had a law in terms of that. We're still segregating children with disabilities, in terms of that. And we still have to have this sort of heroic mother fighting for their individual child, something 30 years since we had law. I mean, we still have, people with disabilities, in terms of the discrimination in employment. But it's not even that. Housing, in terms of that. We talk about accessible, affordable, integrated housing in terms of that. There's a difficulty. I mean, the vast majority of people are in poverty, and we're part of that sort of broader, low-income movement in terms of that. And again, we represent I suppose, creme de creme in terms of that, because we have a whole, mix. And I think one of the really, if there was one thing that I think has been the most phenomenal thing, was the ability to define person with a disability as a legal term. Because when you think about it, we are so fractionalized. People who are blind, people who are deaf, people with cognitive, people who use mobility, aids and things like that. Not to mention all the sort of quote-unquote disease categories that are now there. And, so the sort of evolution of the disability rights movement, started from a real major oppression, and now has really only, I think, just started to get to really what disability rights is about. And, it has been somewhat separate from the traditional civil rights groups. Disability, even though there are people who, see themselves in the progressive movement, I hate to disagree with Kent, but, I really think the disability rights movement has started from its very basis as a conservative movement, because it's been independence. And what has been independence? Independence from government, independence from the paternalistic. It was started by people who were very conservative. We have a couple of people in our history that, everybody thinks it's a progressive, sort of like in the same civil rights as other movements. I totally disagree. I think one of the things, and why our rhetoric played so well with President Reagan and, who signed the ADA, President Bush, was for that very reason. Because when you listen to the rhetoric of the disability rights movement, you will see that it fits into really a lot of the same conservative rhetoric. The only difference the Democrats do is they give you money, where the other party doesn't. So, and we need that sort of thing. So that, in that sense, we're really a movement without a political affiliation, because we get paternalism from the Democrats and we get no support services from the Republicans. So, I would say that we're either non or bipartisan, rather than being progressive.
I really think that's an interesting perception, because I think you're looking at a perspective from inside the movement, and what you would hope that's how the public would also view it. But after being involved with federal government for many, many years and state government, I can tell you that politicians, for one, and the public to a great extent, view disability with federal programs with subsidies. Like, everyone with a disability gets money either from the federal government or the state government, and that's the only way they're able to exist. And it's that perception that we need to overcome and do away with. And when I went to work in D.C. on the council, one of our charges was to look at all disability programs and all disability dollars in the federal government. Where were they? Well, we found out that there, at that time in 1985, there was about $60 billion being spent directly on disability programs. Those programs were spread around 37 different federal agencies. And in almost every instance where there was more than one disability program in a federal agency, whether there were 2 there or 5 there was no coordination. And in a lot of instances, there was no communication whatsoever between disability programs in the same federal agency. So the National Council released a report, and in fact, Dr. Scotch, we're the ones who commissioned the Lou Harris poll and paid for it. We released a report called Toward Independence in 1985. And one of our recommendations in that report was that Congress needed to enact a comprehensive federal disability law. And Ralph's exactly right. We ended up using the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 as kind of a model for everything that needed to be included in the ADA. We released that report and delivered it to Congress in '85. We waited 2 years for Congress to do something. When they didn't, then that's when we began the process of holding public hearings around the country to draft the language of the ADA.
Yeah. I'm not sure this is totally accurate, but I do remember that in terms of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is modeled right after the Civil Rights Act of '64. I think one point I had heard was that the traditional civil rights community did not want the Civil Rights Act open, so that was, it sort of moved us to have quote, our own Section 504. The other thing I heard was really where the disability community got involved was not so much in getting the 504 language passed, but really the regs passed. That's really where we really showed our sort of first organizing, because I'd always heard in our history that it was actually an able-bodied aide to Senator Hubert Humphrey that actually wrote Section 504. But where the disability rights community, the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, was that it was passed in 1973, but Congress, HEW wouldn't do the regs. And in 1977, there were major protests, I think in 25 cities around the country. 10 cities around the country. I think the longest was in San Francisco for 25 days. And that's really where, we pushed Joseph Califano, then the Secretary of HEW, to actually finally, I think it was May 3rd of 77, to actually issue the rules that implemented Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And just to show you how long it takes, my understanding is it wasn't until 1988 that HUD, Housing and Urban Development, actually issued their final regs. So the bill got passed in 1973. The actual operating regs didn't get passed, and it took protest and the first direct action and occupation of buildings in 77, and then HUD took all the way another something 11 years.
You'd think we were rewriting the Constitution.
Right. I mean, you would think we wanted to do anything but just live or integrate into public facilities, and that was even long before even the thought of the ADA was.
Yeah, I think Representative Charles Vanek was the first person who spoke to the issue of trying to amend the 1964 Civil Rights Act to include disability. Then Senator Humphrey also spoke to that, and they ended up choosing to rather to add a new title to the Rehabilitation Act, which was Title V of the Rehabilitation Act. So he's correct in that they didn't want to open up the Civil Rights Act. And quite frankly, they were concerned that they would lose some things for those who were being protected by opening it up, and you can understand that. But we got our beginning in the Rehab Act rather than in the traditional Civil Rights Act that was passed in '64. And it was Joe Califano who I first went to work for, and I was the first person hired to provide technical assistance in HEW in the regions. They hired 10 people. I was the first of those 10 people that was hired here in Dallas to cover the 5 states in this region. So I kind of can relate to what Bob's talking about with regard to the beginnings of the Rehab Act, which, as Kent said, is kind of the model for what we worked on with the ADA. But 504 really wasn't comprehensive in terms of affecting the full society with the issues that we were trying to address, and that was why we needed
and there were
broader law in the ADA.
Yeah, and there were a lot of arguments as we got into the ADA, both inside the disability community and outside from other legislators about trying to write a comprehensive law rather than writing some stronger individual laws in areas like employment and education and transportation, public access, that kind of thing. I mean, I can remember, we all remember Evan Kemp, who disabled commissioner on the Civil Rights Commission in D.C. And I remember Evan coming before the council at a meeting and really strongly opposing one comprehensive law. He wanted us to go after it issue by issue.
We're going to open this up to questions in a minute, but I wonder, since we're here in the 6th floor museum with a picture of President Kennedy there, if there was any connection to the kinds of ideals and spirit that Kennedy helped to foster in the 60s, and is there any connection there to the disability rights movement?
There's certainly a connection with me because I was injured December the 17th of 1963, which was just a short time after President Kennedy was assassinated. And my memories of President Kennedy were his focus on public service and the beginnings of the civil rights movement, desegregation and all of that. And so it was really many of the things that Martin Luther King did and how he did it that inspired, I think, our movement to say, hey, we're worthy also, and we should take this up as a social cause. And
it's all part of the sort of the era in terms of the women's rights movement, gay, lesbian, the obviously people of color, and disability rights hadn't quite yet come, but it was modeled after and took sort of the energy of that. I mean, I think what ADAPT, as a grassroots activist group is actually filling is when the federal government started to fund independent living centers, it actually zapped the sort of grassroots and became, instead of a grassroots disability rights movement, it became a sort of social service model, case folder model. And actually, if we're almost like the shadow, activism that, couldn't be, it should be in IL because we speak the same language and, come from the same places and are, to some degree, some of the same people. But because of the federal dollars that has basically co-opted to a large degree, and I don't say that totally negatively because there's been some very positive stuff about the funding of independent living centers, but it has zapped, when you take the king's money, you get the king. And so that's exactly what has happened. And so, so I think ADAPT has tried to stay at least as much separate from that. But the other thing that I think needs to be said, there was a really, I think, a critical thing that happened when Health and Education and Welfare became HHS, Health and Human Services, and the Department of Education. Something happened there which I don't think has been noted very well, is the developmental disability community went into Health and Human Services, HHS, medical model, welfare, whatever, and independent living went over to the Department of Education. A little training, a little education, a little peer counseling, and we'll get jobs and we'll live happily ever after. Unfortunately, which is a really positive model and is what Kent was talking about, and I really support that, but that's not what the reality has happened to many people. So what we have now is a dichotomy where we have sort of the DD community over here that was seen as paternalistic medical, and then here were the ILs where we only talk about employment. Well, that would be fine if it's what happened. But actually, since the passage of the ADA, our unemployment level has increased. So one might think it's a little bit more than just discrimination that's going on here, and that these folks who are, quote, in the IL world need some of the same support things, and that's why this issue of community integration, community services, I think bridges not just the, cognitive developmental disability, but also those who are in the traditional. And that's sort of where we're at in a sort of transition of, disability rights and what we're moving towards, for the future. And like I say, all that energy comes from, I think, the 60s and some of those movements and some of those actually idealism that, unfortunately, we've gotten a little jaded here in the 2000s.
Well, why don't we, Ken, unless you wanted to make a comment.
We're sitting here looking at the exhibit, and one of the quotes, the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. President Kennedy truly understood the significance and importance of every individual in this country. And if he would have lived, I firmly believe that he would have carried on an effort to promote the rights of people with disabilities, just like he did civil rights in our country.
Well, and certainly the Kennedy family have had some real personal relationships with disability. They had a sister who had a disability, and so they've continued to deal with disability issues through many years since President Kennedy was assassinated.
Why don't we let some of the rest of us have a comment? We have a microphone that we'll be passing around so that everyone can hear. Nicola, did you
I
wanna-
have a question, just given the strain of the last comments, and I hope it's not considered a heretical question, but we had a president with a disability, and it was very much hidden from the general public. Had FDR lived later, do you think there would have been a faster movement in making change, and that we would not have to wait, 45 years later plus after his death before the ADA legislation was passed?
Oh, no doubt about it. I mean, and I'll give you an example. If we were fighting World War II today, can you imagine hearing about all the deaths on Iwo Jima or Guadalcanal or any of the other famous battles in World War II? I mean, the media of today and the technology that we have is incredible when you're talking about them bringing it to bear on one issue. So if FDR was alive today and serving in the White House in a wheelchair, I think a lot of things from rights to stem cell research would be on the front burner.
FDR couldn't get elected today in this media world, and the battle to get even a little piece of a wheel shown as on his monument in D.C. was a major battle with the Roosevelt family, because again he exhibited what was actually the embarrassment of having a disability, very much so, and it's unclear if he was alive and was able to say, would you want a wheelchair even shown in that monument, whether he would have said, fine. I mean, we made the point and we advocated for that because he was a role model. The other thing that is really amazing when you read some of the books and you look at some of the pictures, D.C. had ramps all over the place, and after he died, they took them all out. They took them all out. I mean, there's all these pictures of these long ramps, where they drove him up onto the steps. And after he died, they went to the trouble of just taking them all away.
But see, I don't necessarily agree with Bob. I think the right candidate with a disability would make an interesting candidate in today's world.
Woman here in the center, I think, wanted to say something. Could you identify yourself?
My name is Carla Springer, and I have a daughter with developmental disabilities and MH issues. We came along right about the time Kent did, but from a different perspective. And in our lives, I've seen two things that we haven't really talked about. I think Public Law 92-142 opened a big floodgate because you got parents from the cradle involved in education. And as those children got older, they became active in movements such as employment, transportation, SSI, housing, and I've seen so many changes, because when my daughter was in the very first Project Kids in the DISD, which the year before that they funded her to go to a private facility. So she was 2 years old, and I've seen so many changes that there weren't any supports for us. There were Easter seals and a couple of other things that were on the periphery, ARC, but I've seen so many areas of growth, and the parents don't have to stumble around and find things that we had to do. As my daughter got older, another piece of legislation came into being that I wrote a lot of letters, I made a lot of phone calls, and it passed anyway. And I think it's one of the reasons we have some employment problems among people with disabilities. It was NAFTA. There was a wonderful program or story on 60 Minutes, and it was in I think U.S. News and World Report, about a man in a small Mississippi town who during the Depression realized a lot of the black families in that small town had developmental disabilities, as we call them now, and a lot of blindness. And he started a broom manufacturing company in that small town. And he did it just because he was good-hearted. He was a banker. And they produced thousands of brooms every year. Well, the minute NAFTA passed, like in 6 months, they had no factory anymore because supports that would have helped them went to Mexico. Unfortunately, in the DISD, in the past, they've really worked on getting the kids transitioned into workshops instead of competitive employment. And because there are people who can be competitively employed, but they took the easy way out, or they didn't have good people who tried to get the kids jobs. But then that started drying up because they can count the widgets in Mexico cheaper. So it's been, you hit these high spots and then you hit these low spots, and you just get tired of fighting the battles. That's one of the reasons we don't have a whole lot of people here tonight, because as your child gets into adulthood, you just get so
You're worn out.
But you touch on what, we didn't mention, the parent movement in the early 70s, the creation of the ARC, the Association of Retarded Citizens, and United Cerebral Palsy, and groups like that. And that was all around, mostly in the beginning, around access to education, public school education. And there was some lawsuits there that was, pushed by parents with disabilities. But one of the things, though, in the disability rights community, which has really, in terms of the consumer movement, which has been, to me, very distressing, is that this arbitrary governmental definition of developmental disability, though it's been helpful in the sense of services, has really hurt us in terms of us and them or other, and we have, even in our advocacy, different groups and they're almost like battling for scarce resources. And we've spent a lot of time trying to work with this group called Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered, the Self-Advocate Movement, in terms of that, because even people with cognitive disabilities, whether it's because of mental retardation, brain injury, we need disability rights activists to get involved in their own thing at whatever level. Not everybody contributes, not everybody's college educated. People, share in the disability rights movement. But the arbitrary definitions of developmental disabilities versus I'm a person with a disability, because I broke my neck at age 27. You were 20, so you are developmentally disabled by definition of age 22 or before. And so it sort of puts us at odds with each other sometimes, not to the benefit. But the parent movement is integral to work with the traditional consumer movement in the disability rights community.
Any other questions or comments? The gentleman in the back and then the woman in front.
Just talking about Roosevelt briefly, he did everything to avoid anybody seeing him. That if you know much about Roosevelt, he would not the guy do it, because when he got his paralysis polio, he spent days crawling up the stairs. Nobody could help him. He did it himself. Of course, Eleanor Roosevelt's a critical factor there, but he'd not be the one to do it. I mean, somebody might do that, but he avoided it. He didn't want it seen. His greatest fear was that he'd be burned to death in a theater. He couldn't get out. He's always had some way to get him out. So I don't think he'd work. I'm interested more about independent centers, how that works, what's going on these days, because is that the next thing we should be looking for? Independent living centers?
Well, I mean, it depends, the term has been sort of...
new generation.
Yeah, I mean, right now, independent living centers are being sort of co-opted. The federal funding was in the disability rights community, and it was meant to be sort of a place where people with disabilities could get some peer counseling, some support service.
Yes, it
and
is not a living community.
It's not a living community.
It is not a center where people with disabilities live.
You integrate them into everybody else, what you want to do.
Right. It's sort of like your area agencies on aging, but was focused in the beginning for mostly people younger with disabilities. It really actually was the start of that, the terminology of changing the paradigm from people advocating for with people with disabilities advocating themselves. It was taking control of the environment by yourself in terms of that. So it was sort of independent living was sort of seen as choice and control. And it actually we talk about independent living / disability rights sort of because they sort of have been sort of integrated, though I think they're now sort of thought of a little bit more separate than they used to be. But it's not a living situation. I've actually suggested that they change their name to community integration centers because right now you can go out and probably in Dallas and you can find a place that has a nursing home, an assisted living, and an independent living center on the same campus, which I think sort of, bastardizes the name and, but that because we think of independent living as the disability rights community.
Yeah, they haven't thought of the funeral home next, but they'll have that.
I always thought that was a good thing for the super collider. You just pop up at different spots,
In the front here, we've got a microphone for you.
Thank you. Good evening. 2 questions. One, how many Americans or residents of this country are disabled?
54 million.
54 million. And 80% of those who are of working age are do not have success finding work.
Unemployed or underemployed.
Wow. Right. My second question goes to contemporary politics of today. I'm interested in your reaction to the political ad that Michael J. Fox is appearing in. It has certainly brought significant attention to a disabled person speaking about a stem cell research, and without all the pros and cons of that. But what has been your reaction of someone speaking out about disabled?
Well, I think it's our obligation to speak to our beliefs and to address our issues. And I think Michael J. Fox has a right to do that. And I think he's trying to express himself with regard to what's important to him in his life. So I don't see anything wrong with it.
Well, it really brings to the forefront a sort of divisive, actually, debate within the disability rights community about cure versus care. Terry Schiavo was another one of the same type where the progressive community sort of jumped on one side and the conservative on the other. From the disability rights perspective, or at least some in the disability rights, the Terry Schiavo was never about, intrusion in family, but it was about a civil rights issue. It was about a person with a significant disability being killed. See, and that never got actually voiced because it was, once Randall Terry became the spokesperson for the Schiavo family, it became about abortion. And no progressive would actually ever listen to the disability rights community, and the major group was a group called Not Dead Yet, that said it isn't about religious zealots, it isn't about, whether she was going to get up and dance or be, quality of life. Because if you use quality of life as a criteria, which is ending up what Terry Schiavo got killed about, then we can go right up to the Fort Worth State School, or the Dallas State School, and you can off a whole bunch of people who we'd all vote. And so it became, when Tom DeLay and Senator Frist, it became really an easy political football to get there. But if you look at it as a disability rights, and Michael J. Fox is the exact same thing it's turning into, because what he was saying was, and the ad was basically about stem cells. And to many, and Kent will probably disagree with me, it's very offensive that a party that we think should be for progressive, their idea is going to cure us. What we want is support for people who are living with disabilities, and that we have this thing, proud and disabled, and that just sort of like, Michael J. Fox would be horrendous. What he wants to do is, and what that ad does, is basically garner pity, and, people say, oh my God, we got to cure that poor fella. Instead of, we have all those people with cerebral palsy. Harvey, that person, was exactly like Michael J. Fox. He shook all over the place. Harvey had a good life. And that's what we've been saying. And so people sometimes take positions that they don't realize are really reinforcing the general public that we shouldn't be existing the way we are. And, so I know that's a little probably...
Well, no, it's Bob brings up an argument which exists in the disability community, and I've been one that's been involved in medical research a great deal, promoted a cure for paralysis. We've raised tens of millions of dollars. I still believe that if we can cure disease, cure paralysis caused by injury, then it's our obligation to do that for many reasons, and it has nothing to do with enabling that person to live a much better quality of life than that person can with a disability. Believe me, that's not the argument involved on the science end. I'm kind of in between. I like the commercial because I understand what's behind it. I also happen to be a personal friends with the president and have known him a long, long time. And we've had conversations about this issue many times, and he knows I don't agree with him. What's disheartening is when politicians decide that stem cell research happens to be a moral issue. But the way that we spend other federal money on other things don't seem to be a moral issue with them. So I don't think the problem necessarily is as much with George Bush as it is with, the current political system that we have, and until we as voters do something about it, then disability is going to suffer along with many other things that we care about.
I think we can have one more comment, Betty.
Mine is probably, I have 3 comments.
Okay.
I'm fairly loud. All those kids. I would agree with you. I don't think those two things have to be exclusive. I think you can promote cure, but also realize that we have a huge number of people with disabilities who have to get through the day and that they need the support. As long as we open and close cases and people get money, our institutions receive money for opening and closing a case. When you have an ongoing problem like mental illness or cognitive disability, someone who is going to require ongoing care, I don't think we can ignore that. The other thing is we were talking about Democrats versus Republicans. I would agree with you, we probably get more money from the Democrats, but they forget to monitor or make people accountable. So there may be $60 million going in, but you find out it's in desks and chairs. We don't get the money to the people who need it, and no one is monitoring or making them accountable to make sure that they are getting the money. All the waiting lists, there's always going to be more people with disabilities than there is money to take care of them. But I think it could be done more efficiently. I've always thought that. And as long as we have money going to programs rather than following the person who needs the money, it's going to be an issue, particularly in education. We have programs that the kids have to fit into, and they have labels and all sorts of things. We've had IDEA, which was a really wonderful piece of legislation, but nobody really read it to figure out that everything that we needed was there. There's a lot of propaganda that goes out that says we can't discipline children with disabilities. That's not true. What the law said was you cannot punish them for something that happens because of their disability, but you can certainly punish them if they are doing something that is outside the realm of their problems. So we're getting a lot of laws changed in education based on hype, perspective, and I think we do get just the black and white side of issues in the news media. It's easier to draw villains. But the kids now are going through No Child Left Behind, which has no accountability in it, no recourse for parents. You can't go in and demand things for your children that you used to be able to do. My daughter's 28. We went through the golden era. I could go in and raise hell and be very nice and smile and get things that you can't get today. They're losing those things. So I think we are splintered, and the word out of Washington is that all of the disability groups asked for something different, and that's their reason for not passing legislation. We're not asking for something different. We're asking for one law that makes basic accommodations for whatever that person wants. But as long as we believe we are asking for different things, then they have a great excuse not to act on that.
I have a need to make one comment. Civil rights law is about people. It's not about cases.
That's true.
And the thing that you have to look at is the person. We're primarily people who happen to live with a disability. And my comment on the earlier question about Michael J. Fox is, we as people have a right to express ourselves however we choose. Now, as long as you understand that that's coming from a person who has a right within this democratic society to express themselves, well, then you get an understanding of my comment. But in terms of who people with disabilities are, they are not people who are tied to programs. They are people. And those programs are available to them in order to allow them the same opportunities as other people to access the mainstream of society. So it's kind of looking at it backwards if you look at them from the standpoint of the program.
I would agree with you, but I think what happens is the person has to fit into a program, that we're not looking at them as individuals and their individual needs.
See, the one place we all are, people with disabilities, is under the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is really the thing, it's sort of the thing that meshes us together. But it's really like a tossed salad, because we're tomatoes, cucumbers, radishes, lettuce, and what other vegetable you might want to be today. But the problem is that the silos and the funding stream and the support services has so fractionalized it. Vocational rehabilitation is the perfect thing. When it was done, you know, there was people who were blind had a separate, because they were the most severe, and you know, then there were everybody else. And there was the thing called, you know, the 3 H's, hernia, hysterectomy, and heart attacks, and then there was more significant. Now, people who are blind are not the most severe. They are just people who have severe disabilities. But we have not changed our funding stream, because they get per capita more money per individual than we do over in the regular vocational rehabilitation. Try to bring into one vocational rehabilitation system, and you will have people marching on your lawn with dogs and canes, protesting, and do a great job. And I love that they do self-interest advocating. But from a systems way, it's terribly inefficient. We have the same thing with cognitive and MRDD. We have the exact same thing now. Now the newest thing, we're going to have the new silo, is autism, because and not that autism is not a significant need, but we have programs that could be integrated to address that, but we won't do that because we're going to get a new funding stream. Why? Because we are a major crop. You know, someone talked about NAFTA. You know, we're not manufacturing. Where do we make money? We're using people with disabilities to make money for a bunch of professionals. And the more we can be defined as significantly disabled, where we can get OTs, PTs, psychologists, psychiatrists, everybody's making money off of us. You know, if we were going to use the bus boycott as an analogy, we would just say, no professional is going to touch me today. My God, the economy would go gaga. I mean, you take one person with a cognitive disability, that's 11 professionals. Now,
Okay,
I don't
but-
mean that person doesn't need help, but it's an outrageous waste of taxpayers' money. And what is that person going to do? They can't integrate because they're too busy waiting for the professional. to come
Before
in.
he got into the new math model on economics and what we can mean to the economy, Bob made a great point with the federal money streams, because
I knew he'd pick on that one.
in Texas we just had an opportunity to blend all that money together when we went through this so-called consolidation of Health and Human Services. I served as chairman of the Texas Rehabilitation Commission Board for the years during that before and during the consolidation. And we argued up and down the halls, the governor's office, and every place else about this is the time to now take all the VOC money and put it all in one pot. And let's blend the disability programs together and really get this right. And what we have is the exact opposite. We have a consolidation, but we still have all the separate money streams.
Well, and that's what my point is that, in the schools, we have the ability to serve all of these people and do the programs or the supports that they need. But what they do is, they have these, you have to
Right.
fit into these
You
slots.
have to fit, yeah.
And I would contend the advocacy in the parent movement has tried to make each individual parent an expert and an advocate for their kid, rather than taking a good community organizing model and getting those mothers from hell, as they're described. And they are, I know, and they're great. Instead of getting them together, they make you an expert. They send you to these parent trainings where they give you a file drawer of things, paper, that you're supposed to take back and become an expert and fight all these professionals when they sit around on your IEPs things, these ARDs. I mean, here you have this parent there with all these people smoking their pipes and these women with power suits, and you're supposed to be able to fight them, right? Oh, no, but then you got to bring in a lawyer. So now we have our protection and advocacy, so more lawyers make money off of us.
We really. There's someone in the back who's been trying to get a point in, so let's have one last comment from the audience and a response, and then we'll wrap this up. Yes, ma'am.
A fairly easy question. My brother suffered a severe spinal cord injury when he was 2, and that was back in 1956. And so I grew up and I saw the changes over the years, and bless you to all the advocates that went out there and fought for the ability to get in and out of a restaurant. My question is, from a layperson's perspective, what are a couple of key things that a citizen can do to help further the needs that need to be, the issues that need to be accomplished? What are some things we can do from the ground level?
Write tickets every time you see somebody illegally using a handicapped parking space, which if we could actually do that in every community, it would be amazing what might happen.
I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it anyhow. We should have a hanging of the doctor in Dealey Square here for issuing handicapped parking spots to people who don't deserve it, because everyone gets upset at the person parking in there. What they don't get upset at is the doctor who signs off so all these people can get it. But to answer your question, I mean, one thing is, again, I don't know in this community, if, grassroots organization, we really do need people and their time and energy. I mean, I cannot tell you how important it is to get new blood, new energy, different resources, and I don't mean resources only in money, but skill level. Because what happens in our community is, we have a lot of people don't have jobs, they don't travel, so their circle of influence is very narrow. And so as much as that can be expanded, but being part of as, can be, I think, very, very helpful. Again, I don't know this community, where that might be, but that's where I really think.
And if you don't think your city ordinances are strong enough with regard to access public accommodations, be a voice at City Hall.
And when you feel like your rights are being violated, well, address those through the proper authorities so that they know about them.
Well, I think we're about out of time. First of all, I'd like to thank the Sixth Floor Museum and their staff for taking this issue seriously and inviting us all here to participate. I'd like to thank the audience for coming and out on a wet night and listening and discussing this. And I'd also like to thank each of our panelists for your very insightful comments. And I hope we'll have some more conversations about disability issues here in Dallas. And thank you again.